I've mentioned several times in the past that I have a degree in cartooning, aka making comics. Even before going off to college, I greatly enjoyed making comics as a kid, grabbing large pieces of paper and making comic strips of whatever stories I had in my head. In fact, I liked making them so much that I went on to college with the goal of making comics for a living. That experience was... okay, it had its ups and downs, and I feel like I only got good at my craft and really just art in general after graduating. But there were still some valuable tips I learned during my time in art school that I still apply to my works today, from tips and time-saving tricks to some more ironclad rules of comic making. And hey, I have a YouTube channel, so what better thing to do than to put my degree to good use? We know, wall of text, you can go away now. This is a non-exhaustive list and doesn't cover absolutely everything I learned, because there were a lot of things I learned in college, and some of those subjects frankly require their own video. Writing scripts and inking come to mind. Also, this video will cover the rules of comic making as they apply to the traditional comic structure, as opposed to vertical scrolling formats like those you'll find on Webtoon, as some of the rules that I'll be discussing are slightly different for vertical form comics. I will also demonstrate the topics I'll be talking about in this video with some silly doodles, but also with some examples from my older work too. But regardless, if you're new here and you want to see some of the more important things that I learned and how you can apply them to your own comic making process, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, then welcome back to the spaghetti layer. Either way, strap your butts in because here we go! Let's start with a huge part of the bigger picture when it comes to making comic pages. Panel composition. The part where you take your squares and mash them together with other squares until you have a sequential formation of squares. But there is a science to mashing these squares together. And they aren't always squares. Unless that's your intention, in which case that's fine too. But let's talk about the science behind mashing the squares or panels together. The entire process of creating a comic page is like a puzzle. Every piece fits together in a specific fashion. Of course, the pieces can be mixed and matched in various different ways, but the principles of producing a coherent reading experience are the same regardless. First things first, make it interesting. An important part of making a comic is ensuring that the readers want to turn the page, so with each panel you want to switch things up. This can be done by employing various camera angles. I say camera angles pretty loosely here since there is no camera involved. These can be anything from wide shots to extreme close-ups. Ideally, you want to keep from using the same kind of angle or similar angles, or even showing the same subject in the same way for an extended period of time. This especially goes for mid-range or close shots. And I'm bringing this up because I, unfortunately, used to be the queen of the bust shots when I was in college. Basically, if your camera angles can be adjusted, then it's a good idea to do so. But if you do want to keep the similar camera angles, then you ideally want to make them visually interesting, whether that's through color or detail. As for panels themselves, it's always a good idea to play around with the shapes and the sizes of those panels. As I said, they don't always have to be perfect squares, unless you want them to be. They can be rectangles, triangles, or, if you're feeling adventurous, circles. And occasionally, you can even do away with panel borders entirely. It's also important to be mindful of how many panels you're putting on the page. A good middle ground is to have your page be broken up into 3 or 4 tiers of panels. Any more and you might risk overcrowding. However, it's also important that things make sense in some way to prevent confusion on the part of the reader. There are multiple ways that this can happen, not just in panel composition, but I'll cover those scenarios throughout the video. For panel composition specifically, you can save yourself a few headaches and a half by adhering to the intended reading order throughout your entire comic. Whether that's right to left like manga, or left to right like a lot of Western comics. You also want your word balloons or speech bubbles, or whatever you want to call them, to flow in a certain direction, such as top to bottom. And the reading order of your panels should also follow the same pattern. If you have a word balloon placed higher than the one that's supposed to come before it, it'll leave the reader confused as to which word balloon they're supposed to read first. Similarly, if your comic is left to right and your first few word balloons read the other way around, it will also leave the reader confused. Again, it's a bit like a puzzle. Sticking true to things like reading order and general readability are greatly beneficial not just to the reader, but also to you. You don't want to create headaches for yourself. Source, just trust me, bro. Before I fully finish up on the subject of panel composition, let's briefly go on a tangent. No, I'm not talking about geometry tangents or conversational tangents, but you'd be forgiven for thinking I was actually about to do that. In comics, tangents happen when two or more lines interact in a way that insinuates an unintentional relationship, creating confusion in the audience as to what they're looking at. There are several types of tangents. These can be the result of things such as a lack of spatial awareness, or not even realizing that you've set the grounds for a tangent to occur in the first place. But let's go over a few of them, and talk about how I personally avoid these tangents from occurring in my art. Let's first talk about a type of tangent that's been referred to as the long line. This happens when the line of one object in a panel runs right into another one, causing the two to blend together and give the illusion of a singular, long line. Another type of tangent, and one that I've committed several times over the years, is when the lines of two separate objects directly touch each other without overlapping. Among a couple other things, both of these tangents can ruin the illusion of depth, or the illusion of being three-dimensional that your artwork might already have. A simple method of avoiding these two types of tangents is being aware of where you're placing your lines, or other objects that might run the risk of forming a tangent. For example, if you have a character brushing their hair behind their ear and it's in a profile view, have their wrist or arm overlap the side of their head. If your character is standing in front of a building and the bottom of their pants directly overlaps with one of the lines making up the building they're standing in front of, adjust the lines accordingly. But if for whatever reason you're unable to prevent tangents from forming this way, the thing that I do in this scenario is break up the containing lines for each object by using the erase tool or with a white pen. The third tangent I want to mention is something called the panel-to-panel tangent, which is essentially the same as a long line tangent, but instead it's broken up by a panel gutter, which is the empty space between comic panels. I'll talk about those in a few moments. If this type of tangent isn't resolved, it can make for some funky and confusing visuals. Fortunately, this can be resolved in a way similar to the other tangents I mentioned, by breaking up the lines that are causing the tangent to form. In this case, you can simply move your illustrations around in a way that will break up the long line. Also, it's not just the artwork itself that you have to keep an eye on when it comes to tangents. You also have to worry about the placement of your word balloons. Yes, you can form tangents with word balloons, and if I recall correctly, my teachers said it was a pretty big no-no in the comic production process. Well, okay. I'm not sure if these are officially tangents, but they were referred to as such during critiques, so I'm just rolling with it. I'll talk more about word balloons later on, but let's talk about the tangent part of it first. Word balloon-related tangents can be formed through ill-informed placements of word balloons, resulting in a pocket of space between the balloon itself and the edge of the panel. They can also be formed when the edges of two word balloons touch, or if there's too little space between them. Again, I'll elaborate on the placement of word balloons later on. Let's now move on to establishing shots. Establishing shots serve as an indicator that a new scene is taking place in a different setting, and it also tells the reader where and when the new scene is taking place. Aside from comics, establishing shots can also be used in film and television, but its general purpose is the same: establishing context for the new scene. When switching scenes, it's important to give the reader enough information about where the new scene takes place. Does it take place outside, inside, in a cardboard box, in the middle of nowhere? There should be something that the reader can latch onto, because if you don't give the reader an idea of where the new scene takes place, it can create confusion. Imagine skipping from one scene in one panel to another panel that takes place somewhere else with a new set of characters with little, if any, context beforehand. I know that's happened to me at least once. Establishing shots are often wide shots, which can give the reader a generous amount of information in regards to setting. Something I learned after college was that it's sometimes okay to not have the establishing shot be immediately at the start of the scene. There can be a small build-up before the big reveal, offering some small context clues prior to that in the form of closer shots, but this really depends on how you choose to tell the story. If you have some experience with making comics, or just have general knowledge of the subject as a whole, you might know about gutters, the blank spaces between the panels. The gutters should be equal in size when making your comic pages, which in turn means that the panels should all be equidistant from each other. There are, however, some exceptions to the rule. For example, it's perfectly fine to have panels overlap each other once in a while, but this is just a general rule of thumb. Now let's go to word balloons. Yeah, that's weird, I don't know where that came from. Contrary to what I used to think before going to college, word balloons are actually easier to mess up than you think. Like all of the other components I'm mentioning in this video, word balloons, or rather the placement of those word balloons, are an important part of the puzzle that is the comic page. Even with something that looks very simple, there's multiple things to keep in mind. You might put word balloons in your comics, you might not, but here's what to keep in mind should you put speech bubbles in your comic. The first thing, and I feel like this is one of the more important ones, is that the tail of the word balloon should be pointed in the general direction of the character's mouth. Try not to have the tail be pointed too high or too low, because, let's be real here, you probably don't want to make it seem like the character's nose just gained the ability to communicate verbally. Even if the word balloon is farther away from the character, the tail should still be pointed in that general direction, or at least in the general direction of the character who's speaking. And speaking of tail placement, there's another thing to keep in mind in conjunction with the aforementioned rule. You should keep the tail on either the top or the bottom of the word balloon itself. Try to keep the tail away from the sides. Another very important thing to keep in mind is the placement of your speech bubbles. Under ideal circumstances, you want to keep them from obscuring your characters, but as long as you don't cover up anything important, you should be okay. However, regardless of where you put your word balloons, you should never cover the faces of important characters. Or, for that matter, any part of their heads. I've also read somewhere that you should also try to avoid covering their hands or feet with a word balloon if you can help it. Something that can help with any word balloon placement blunders is mapping out where to put the word balloons first after you've set up your panels, but before you get to drawing anything else. This can pose a bit of a challenge at first, since you will have to work around the word balloon as you're drawing the art itself, but it will definitely save you a few headaches if you already struggle with word balloon placement. With the actual text inside the word balloons, the size of the text should be consistent throughout your comic, regardless of how many pages you have. Except in special circumstances like emphasizing certain words or lines. Or doing this. Finding the right text size may require some trial and error. You should keep readability in mind while simultaneously conforming to all of the general rules. You don't want your text to be too big, but you also don't want your text to be so small that the reader has to stick their face in the pages just to see what's written. The empty space around your word balloon shouldn't be too wide or too narrow either. As with many parts of the comic production process, finding the perfect middle ground is key. One last thing I want to talk about with word bubbles is understanding just how much text to put in each word balloon. If you have a character talking at length, don't cram all of their lines into a single balloon. It's best to break it up into multiple balloons where possible, while still keeping a tangent or two from forming. Ideally, you want to keep all of text from occurring in your comics, whether it's in the form of a word balloon or even a narration text box, especially if you're transcribing some exposition from your script onto the page. And if that's the case, you may want to rewrite that exposition so it's not coming to the reader all in one go. But I should probably save that for a video where I talk about writing comic scripts. Anyway. When coloring our comics, we were given a few basic rules, all with the end goal of physical printing in mind. And we did regularly print our comic pages. If it wasn't for short comic projects or zines, then it was for our junior thesis. Yes, we had a junior thesis, and it was an experience that probably warrants its own storytime video. But anyway, back to the topic. I haven't printed any comics in a hot minute, since graduation actually, but the rules I learned in class are rules that I still apply to my own coloring when I work on my comics. Most of them anyway. I think these rules both apply to strictly digital comics and comics that were made with printing in mind, so I'll be going over all of the coloring rules I learned at the same time. The biggest rule I took away from my experience is that you shouldn't have your colors be too bright or oversaturated. What do I mean by that? I mean you should refrain from having colors that are all the way on the upper right side of the color square or anything in that vicinity. Or, if you want to get technical, any color outside of the color gamut. The gamut range varies slightly depending on the hue you use, but it's a range to be avoided all the same, especially for printing. If you use a color outside of the color gamut when you take your comic to print, the results when the image is printed will be different from the color you used during the coloring stage, which can affect the quality of the work when printed. And this is also personal experience, and coming from someone who used to use very bright colors as a kid, colors that aren't so saturated are often less harsh on the eyes. But, I mean, hey, if you like using bright colors, I won't stop you. Just be aware of how it could affect your comics, or really any of your artwork should you make physical copies of it. Conversely, we were taught not to use any colors that were too dark, or so dark that they made the images or objects within the panel unreadable. Line art, if you use it, is of course an exception, since it's usually darker than the other colors for the sake of readability. Also, the colors you use shouldn't be too similar if they are adjacent to each other for the same reason. For example, try to refrain from using two colors with similar saturation and/or luminosity side by side. Otherwise, when you factor out the line art, the objects with those similar colors lose their legibility and become one big blob of the same color. Understanding where your light source is also crucial. I actually have a lot more experience working with color than I do with black and white, where everything I just said would pretty much go right out the window. But the general rules of readability still apply. From personal experience, if there are areas that are colored in black, it's better to have the outlines of the blacked out shape be done in white to improve readability. But that's enough about coloring. Let's move on to the next topic. Backgrounds. Everyone's worst nightmare. Unless you like that sort of thing, in which case, teach me your ways, please. Backgrounds. You might like them, you might not like them. But whatever the case may be, they're an essential part of the comic page. Without them, you risk having your artwork and your story suffer from white room syndrome. Even if you haven't heard of it by name, you still might know what it is. White room syndrome is the name given to a writing problem that occurs when a story lacks setting description. Because there isn't enough information given to the reader, it makes the scene feel like it may as well be taking place in a white-walled room. In writing, there's multiple things to worry about when combating white room syndrome, like context, conflict, and setting descriptors. But in comics, resolving this issue is pretty simple. Just add backgrounds. Now, you don't really have to go overboard with backgrounds on every single panel, unless you're some sort of glutton for punishment. Something that can and often will save you a lot of time, and a tip that one of my teachers gave in, I think, my 3rd year of college, is that if you want, you only have to do extensive background detail for one panel on the page, and then have the backgrounds be more minimalistic for the others. Though you'll probably be better off having some semblance of a background in those other panels, whether they're bookshelves, desks, lamps, or plants. Whichever route you end up taking in your background making journey, you should at a bare minimum have something that isn't a white-walled room. Also, and this is very important, make sure the perspective lines up with the characters, or at least have the perspective be believable. Which, not gonna lie, is the option I go for, since I am still bad at perspective. Although I have Clip Studio Paint's tools and other thingies to help me out. Please sponsor me. If you're not careful, you will have some very disastrous mishaps in your final product, which happen to me more times than I can count. Being mindful of where an object is supposed to be in a setting, or where a character is supposed to be standing, can help you immensely. Otherwise, you're going to have some pretty noticeable blunders. And even if you don't notice these errors, chances are someone else will. The story you're trying to tell with your comic should make sense without the speech bubbles, regardless of whether or not you choose to include them, and should make sense to the reader regardless of how you organize your panels and everything else. Whether they're wordless comics or comics that have dialogue and narration, the reader should be able to understand what's going on in some capacity without having to rely on the aforementioned dialogue or narration, if it's included in the finished product. If you rely on the dialogue or the narration, or both, to carry your story forward, or if you rely on those things as the primary storytelling device, then your comic runs the risk of confusing the reader. More than a year ago, I briefly recalled a similar experience I had in my 2nd year of college. One of my teachers at the time voiced his concerns with the effectiveness of the storytelling of my final project for that semester, saying, "This story must rely heavily on the dialogue because I don't get it." Looking back, I think the biggest contributing factor to this mess was that I didn't play around with panel compositions as much as I should have. Instead, settling for the talking heads format I was unfortunately quite fond of at the time. I did start a remake of that comic where I tried to remedy all of the issues that the old comic had, and now that I mention it, I really should finish that remake. Oops. But that brings me to the last point I want to make about storytelling. Properly conveying your intended tone, mood, and multiple other factors that may make up the storytelling aspect of the comic process is key. For example, if a character is happy or sad or angry, let it show on their faces or in their body language. Admittedly, I still need to work on facial expressions, but that's neither here nor there. You can also show it in the camera angle, or even with the coloring if you choose to color your comic. If you're trying to show the passage of time, then it's okay to have several panels of the same shot at different times of the day. If you're trying to illustrate a long moment of silence, or intentionally want to make a single moment feel like 20 minutes, then you can have a series of panels of similar shots, or maybe do a very slow close-up. There's multiple ways to illustrate those kinds of things. But the point is, you should convey those emotions or those feelings on the page as best as you can, as it can greatly help with the storytelling part of your comic. Okay, maybe I should have called this 9 things I learned while making comics in art school, but honestly, I'm too lazy to change it. Then again, I caught a cold last week, and now the ghosts of nose congestions, past, present, and future, are still having a wrestling match in my brain. So maybe I'm feeling a little unhinged too, who knows. What is the 180 rule? It's something I learned in my last year of college, probably, and I feel it's an important part of panel composition that's worth mentioning, though it is also applied to and a known term in filmmaking. Simply put, the 180 rule states that the characters in a scene, usually 2 or more, should always have the same left-right relationship with each other, regardless of camera angle. Imagine there's an invisible line between where your characters are standing, with character A on the right and character B on the left. If you switch their positions up, unless for whatever reason you're doing it on purpose, the reader's understanding of where the characters are in a setting will be thrown off. This can result in making your panels and pages look confusing. A good and simple way to keep from breaking this rule is to stay true to that invisible line you visualized in your head. Or you can put it down on the panel itself. That works too. If you keep the proverbial line in its place, you won't have to worry about defining which side is which in your panels. I've read that this rule can be broken in filmmaking under very special circumstances and with the right intentions, but either way, it's better to avoid confusion on the audience's part. And that is everything I wanted to discuss, which turned out to be quite a lot of words. Again, this isn't absolutely everything I learned during my time in art school, but these are some of the more important rules that I learned in regards to making comics specifically. You can, of course, experiment as you see fit. Strictly speaking, there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to comics, and as I've said on this channel before, rules are made to be broken, and you don't have to follow every single rule to a T. But everything I've mentioned here is always good to keep in mind if you're not sure where to start with the comic making process, or you need some pointers on how to improve your comics, or you want to know just what kinds of major comic blunders to avoid regardless of how you choose to experiment. Personally, I still have a ways to go myself when it comes to making comics, and make a very long story short, I haven't made as much comics in the last few years as I probably should, but when I do make comics, I always keep these things in mind. Mostly because they're the most valuable takeaways I've gotten since my college days, and also because I'm aware that these rules aren't quite as breakable as the ones I haven't mentioned. So hopefully these tips can help you with your comics the same way they helped me. But anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked this video and you want to see more art-related videos and shenanigans from me, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. I post new videos every other Friday, usually about drawing or what have you, but sometimes I dabble in other art-related things as well. If you want to support me further, please check out my other social media accounts, as well as my Ko-fi and my Etsy shop, which are all in the description. And lastly, if you made it this far, leave a broom emoji in the comment section below. And remember to keep things civil in the comments, or I will put a whoopee cushion in your chair when you least expect it. And yeah, that's about everything. Thanks for watching. Oh, before I forget, there is one more thing I want to mention. Since this video was about comics, and the background footage was of me making my webcomic, it's only right that I announce this.